The silence is deliberate. Patton's commanders understand that firing too early would reveal their positions while the German armor remains beyond the most effective range. They resist every instinct to open fire. Closer, 500 meters, closer still. Then, almost simultaneously, the valley erupts. Dozens of American guns unleash a coordinated storm of steel. Anti-tank rounds streak across the open ground, striking leading German vehicles with astonishing precision. Heavy artillery crashes down behind the advancing formations, cutting off supporting infantry while filling the air with dirt, smoke, and flying fragments of rock. The carefully prepared minefields begin claiming their first victims as explosions throw tracks and suspension wheels into the air. Within moments, the neat German advance dissolves into chaos. One panzer slews sideways after losing a track blocking those behind it. Another erupts into flames after an armor-piercing shell punches through its side. Crews scramble from damaged vehicles only to find themselves caught in artillery fire. Radio operators desperately attempt to reorganize formations that have suddenly lost all momentum. The burning Sherman at the edge of the battlefield is no longer the defining image of the morning. Now, German armor is burning too. For the first time since arriving in Tunisia, American soldiers watch experienced Axis forces struggle to advance against a defense that refuses to break. The psychological transformation is immediate. Confidence begins replacing doubt. Men who only weeks earlier questioned whether they could stand against German veterans now see enemy tanks halted, disabled, and destroyed before their eyes. Yet this battle is about far more than a single engagement in the Tunisian desert. It represents the moment when an army bruised by defeat begins proving, to itself as much as to its enemies, that it can learn, adapt, and fight on equal terms against one of the most formidable military machines in the world. The flames rising above El Guettar do not simply illuminate burning steel. They mark the beginning of a different American army. The transformation had not happened overnight. It had been forged through failure, uncomfortable honesty, and relentless preparation. Only a month earlier, the American army in North Africa had faced one of the greatest embarrassments in its young wartime history. The Battle of the Kasserine Pass exposed weaknesses that experienced German commanders exploited with ruthless efficiency. Units became separated, communications collapsed, artillery support arrived too late or not at all, and inexperienced officers struggled to react to rapidly changing situations. Although the defeat was far from catastrophic in strategic terms, its psychological impact was enormous. Newspapers back home questioned whether American forces were ready for modern mechanized warfare, while Allied commanders privately wondered how long it would take before the United States could match the battlefield experience of Britain and Germany. Patton arrived with little patience for excuses. His reputation had already been established during earlier campaigns, where he earned both admiration and criticism for demanding absolute discipline. Helmets had to be worn correctly. Vehicles were expected to remain spotless despite the desert dust. Weapons were inspected constantly. Soldiers grumbled about the seemingly endless regulations, yet Patton understood something many overlooked. Order in the smallest details often translated into order when shells began falling. An army that maintained discipline during routine tasks was far more likely to remain organized under extreme pressure. Training intensified across the camps scattered through southern Tunisia. Infantry practiced moving alongside armor instead of operating independently. Artillery officers rehearsed firing missions repeatedly until calculations became instinctive. Radio operators drilled procedures designed to prevent the communication failures that had crippled earlier operations. Engineers studied aerial photographs, walked the ground whenever possible, and carefully identified terrain that could channel enemy tanks into predictable routes. The landscape around El Guettar offered both opportunity and danger. Unlike the broad open desert often associated with North Africa, the area consisted of rocky ridges, dry riverbeds known as wadis, and narrow valleys that naturally restricted movement. To an experienced commander, such terrain acted like a funnel. Large armored formations could not simply spread across the countryside. Instead, they were forced into confined approaches where carefully positioned defenders could concentrate their firepower. That understanding shaped every aspect of the American defense. Engineers worked for days laying extensive minefields. Historical records differ on the exact number, but estimates suggest several thousand anti-tank and anti-personnel mines were buried along likely German routes of advance. Each mine weighed only a few ograms, yet together they created invisible obstacles capable of halting vehicles weighing more than 30 tons. Even when a mine failed to destroy a tank outright, blowing away a track often immobilized it, leaving it exposed to artillery and anti-tank fire. Behind these minefields stood one of the most important weapons of the battle, the American 57mm anti-tank gun. Although modest in appearance, the weapon represented a considerable improvement over earlier equipment. Based on the successful British 6-pounder design, it fired armor-piercing shells at velocities exceeding 850 meters per second. To the gun crew, the recoil felt like a powerful shove through the carriage. To the crew inside an approaching Panzer, the projectile arrived with almost no warning. The gun itself weighed roughly 1,250 kilograms, about as much as a small family car today. Normally towed by a jeep or half-track, it could be concealed surprisingly well behind rocks or shallow earthworks. Once dug into position, only the narrow barrel often remained visible. From several hundred meters away, it blended almost perfectly into the dusty landscape. Yet Patton knew anti-tank guns alone would never stop a determined armored assault. Artillery formed the true backbone of the defense. American doctrine increasingly emphasized rapid, concentrated artillery fire directed by forward observers equipped with reliable radio communications. Instead of each battery acting independently, multiple batteries could engage a single target within minutes. This system created devastating concentrations of fire precisely where they were needed most. The standard 105mm M2A1 howitzer exemplified this philosophy. Its barrel measured just over 2 meters in length, and the complete weapon weighed approximately 2,260 kilograms. Each high-explosive shell weighed close to 15 kilograms, carrying enough explosive to shower deadly fragments across an area larger than a football pitch. A well-trained crew could sustain several rounds per minute, turning previously quiet valleys into landscapes of exploding earth and flying steel. Equally important was the organization behind these guns. Fire direction centers gathered information from observers scattered across the battlefield, calculated firing data using maps, protractors, and mathematical tables, then transmitted precise instructions to waiting batteries. Long before digital computers existed, these calculations relied upon disciplined teamwork and extraordinary speed. Within moments, dozens of guns separated by kilometers could deliver shells onto the same patch of ground almost simultaneously. German commanders had encountered effective artillery before, but increasingly they noticed something different about American fire control. The response seemed unusually rapid. Concentrations appeared with remarkable accuracy. Defensive positions that initially looked thin suddenly unleashed overwhelming firepower. It created the impression that the Americans possessed far more artillery than they actually did. The defenders also benefited from improved intelligence. Aircraft, flying tactical reconnaissance, photographed roads, ridges, and likely assembly areas before the battle. These images, combined with detailed maps prepared by engineer units, allowed artillery officers to register likely targets in advance. Rather than searching for enemy positions once combat began, many firing coordinates had already been calculated. When German armor appeared exactly where planners expected, the response became almost immediate. Facing them was the formidable 10th Panzer Division, one of Germany's experienced armored formations in North Africa. Its core strength included Panzer III and Panzer IV medium tanks, supported by self-propelled guns, infantry, and anti-tank units. Although exact operational numbers varied from day to day because of maintenance and previous combat losses, the attacking force remained powerful enough to overwhelm an unprepared defense. The Panzer IV, particularly later variants equipped with the long-barreled 75mm gun, represented a dangerous opponent. Weighing roughly 25 tons and protected by frontal armor approaching 80 millimeters on some models, it combined mobility with significant firepower. Against inexperienced defenders, these vehicles had repeatedly demonstrated their ability to break through defensive lines before infantry could reorganize. But El Guettar would not resemble previous battles. When German armor advanced into the carefully prepared killing zones on March 23rd, American artillery opened with devastating precision. Minefields slowed the leading tanks exactly where planners intended. Immobilized vehicles created bottlenecks, forcing following formations to maneuver under intense shell fire. Anti-tank guns waited until enemy armor entered effective range before revealing their positions, striking vulnerable flanks as confusion spread through the advancing columns. Several German attacks continued throughout the day, each seeking weak points in the American line. Again and again they encountered overlapping fields of fire that made coordinated movement increasingly difficult. Dust clouds, exploding shells, and burning vehicles reduced visibility, complicating command decisions on both sides. Yet, unlike at Kasserine, American units maintained communication. Artillery continued responding quickly. Infantry held their trenches despite mounting casualties. If you are finding this story compelling, a quick subscribe genuinely helps the channel bring more carefully researched military history to a wider audience. By nightfall, the battlefield around El Guettar had become a graveyard of shattered vehicles and churned earth. The German advance had not disappeared, but its momentum had been broken. For the first time in the Tunisian campaign, Patton's army had demonstrated that preparation, discipline, and coordinated firepower could blunt one of Germany's most experienced armored assaults. The lesson would echo far beyond the deserts of North Africa. The fighting at El Guettar immediately invited comparison with the armored doctrine that had carried Germany to victory across Europe during the opening years of the war. The Wehrmacht's greatest strength had never been its tanks alone. It lay in the way armor, infantry, artillery, and air power operated as a single, coordinated force. German commanders sought to identify a weak point, strike it with overwhelming speed, and exploit the resulting confusion before their opponents could react. It was a method that had shattered Poland in 1939, driven through France in 1940, and carried German armies deep into the Soviet Union the following year. At El Guettar, however, the Americans answered that doctrine with one of their own. Rather than relying upon individual acts of heroism or isolated tank duels, Patton's commanders integrated every available weapon into a carefully organized defensive system. Minefields slowed the attackers. Forward observers directed artillery with remarkable speed. Anti-tank guns waited patiently until the enemy entered lethal range. Infantry protected the guns while engineers kept supply routes open behind the front. No single element won the battle. Together, they became far stronger than the sum of their parts. There were differences in equipment as well. The German Panzer IV remained a formidable fighting vehicle, particularly with its high-velocity 75mm gun capable of defeating many Allied tanks at considerable distances. American Shermans, by contrast, often sacrificed heavier armor for mechanical reliability and ease of production. Critics would later argue about which design was superior in a one-to-one engagement, yet such comparisons overlooked an essential reality. Wars are rarely decided by isolated duels. They are decided by logistics, maintenance, communications, and the ability to replace losses. The United States possessed advantages that Germany increasingly struggled to match. American factories produced thousands of tanks, guns, lorries, and aircraft on an industrial scale that astonished even Allied planners. The M4 Sherman, although imperfect, could be manufactured quickly, transported efficiently, and repaired in the field using standardized parts. Crews appreciated its dependable engine and comparatively spacious interior, while mechanics valued a design that allowed damaged components to be replaced without dismantling the entire vehicle. Germany produced technically impressive machines, but often at the cost of complexity. As the war progressed, heavier tanks such as the Panther and Tiger entered service with thicker armor and more powerful guns. They inspired understandable fear among Allied crews, yet they demanded greater maintenance, consumed more fuel, and required specialized parts that became increasingly difficult to supply. A tank that could not reach the battlefield because of mechanical failure contributed nothing to the fighting. Artillery offered another revealing contrast. German guns remained highly effective throughout the campaign, but the American system of centralized fire control proved increasingly flexible. Forward observers equipped with reliable wireless sets could request support from multiple batteries within minutes. Fire direction centers calculated trajectories with remarkable speed, allowing shells to arrive almost simultaneously from widely separated positions. This responsiveness often surprised German commanders, who found themselves under concentrated bombardment shortly after revealing their positions. Air power also began shifting the balance. During the early North African campaign, Axis aircraft frequently contested Allied control of the skies. By the spring of 1943, however, growing numbers of Allied fighters and fighter bombers increasingly restricted German freedom of movement. Although weather and operational demands meant aircraft were not always available, their presence forced Axis columns to disperse, camouflage carefully and move cautiously during daylight. Every delay reduced the momentum upon which German armored tactics depended. El Guettar, therefore, represented more than a local victory. It illustrated how the Allies were learning to combine industrial strength, tactical flexibility, and improving battlefield experience into an increasingly effective fighting force. The Germans remained dangerous opponents, but the balance was beginning to shift in ways that would become even more apparent during the invasions of Sicily, Italy, and eventually northwest Europe. The battle's immediate strategic impact was significant, though historians continue to debate precisely how decisive it proved. Patton's Second Corps held its ground despite repeated assaults, preventing Axis forces from achieving another breakthrough similar to Kasserine. German commanders were compelled to commit valuable armored formations without securing the rapid victory they had expected. Every tank damaged, every experienced crew lost, and every delay imposed upon their operations further weakened the Axis position in Tunisia. The psychological consequences may have been even greater than the material ones. For American soldiers, El Guettar demonstrated that German armor was neither unstoppable nor invincible. Veterans later recalled how confidence spread through the ranks after seeing disciplined artillery fire and carefully prepared defenses halt experienced panzer units. That confidence could not be measured in destroyed vehicles or captured ground, yet it would accompany these men into every campaign that followed. For Patton personally, the battle strengthened his reputation as an aggressive commander who demanded excellence while inspiring confidence in those under his command. His insistence on discipline remained controversial, and some of his methods would later attract justified criticism. Yet even many detractors acknowledged that he transformed the effectiveness of Second Corps during one of the most critical periods of its development. The army that emerged from Tunisia bore little resemblance to the uncertain force that had stumbled through Kasserine only weeks before. The exact number of German tanks destroyed at El Guettar varies between historical accounts, partly because contemporary reports often counted damaged vehicles differently from those permanently lost. Estimates generally agree that the Axis suffered substantial armored losses during repeated attacks, while American casualties, though significant, were far lower than many had feared at the beginning of the battle. Such differences remind us that wartime records are rarely perfect. Confusion, overlapping reports, and the chaos of combat make absolute precision difficult even decades later. Today, the battlefield itself remains remarkably quiet. The valleys and ridges of southern Tunisia have long since returned to the rhythms of ordinary life. Visitors walking across the rocky ground may still recognize the contours that shaped the fighting, The narrow approaches, the dry wadis, and the commanding heights where artillery observers once scanned the horizon. Museums in both the United States and Europe preserve examples of the Sherman tank, the 57mm anti-tank gun, and the 105mm howitzer, allowing later generations to appreciate the machines that played such decisive roles. Yet no museum can fully recreate the noise, confusion, and uncertainty experienced by those who stood there on that March morning. The smoke rising from the burning Sherman at dawn eventually drifted away on the desert wind. The flames died, the twisted steel cooled, and another wreck joined the countless machines abandoned across the battlefields of the Second World War. On its own, it changed nothing. A single destroyed tank has never determined the outcome of a campaign. What changed everything was the decision made in the moments that followed. Patton could have ordered another withdrawal. His commanders could have fallen back to more comfortable ground. The memories of Kasserine offered every reason to avoid another confrontation with veteran German armor. Instead, they chose to stand where they were. They trusted their preparations, their artillery, and perhaps most importantly, the soldiers who had spent weeks learning painful lessons from earlier defeat. When the German tanks emerged through the dust, they did not find an army waiting to escape. They found one waiting to fight. Every mine buried beneath the desert floor represented hours of patient engineering. Every artillery calculation reflected disciplined training rather than improvisation. Every anti-tank gun concealed behind stone walls stood exactly where planners believed it would matter most. None of these preparations guaranteed victory, but together they transformed probability. They turned uncertainty into resilience. That is why Guettar occupies such an important place in the history of the American Army during the Second World War. It was not the largest battle. It did not involve the greatest number of tanks, nor did it decide the war in a single dramatic afternoon. Its importance lay elsewhere. It marked the point at which an army accepted its failures, adapted with remarkable speed, and proved that it could meet one of the world's most experienced military forces on equal terms. The German offensive stalled. Tunisia would soon be lost to the Axis. From there, the Allies would cross the Mediterranean, invade Sicily, fight their way through Italy, and eventually return to the beaches of northwest Europe. The road to those victories was long, costly, and uncertain, but one of its most important foundations was laid in a dusty Tunisian valley where retreat was no longer considered the inevitable answer. The burning tank became more than wreckage. It became a reminder that defeat is never the final chapter unless an army chooses to stop learning. At Guettar, amid smoke, steel, and the relentless roar of artillery, the Americans learned that lesson. And once they did, the course of the war began to change.